Okay, I think I'm up.
You
Thank
are.
you, Susan. And thank you, San Francisco CNPS, for inviting me to speak to you about aesthetic pruning in California habitat gardens. We plant habitat gardens as an invitation to wildlife. We enjoy seeing birds nest in our gardens and munch on caterpillars. A fox eating some berries in our backyard would make our week. This focus on wildlife is what makes habitat garden pruning different from other types of pruning. In a habitat garden, the insides of shrubs and trees are allowed to tangle a bit, stay denser, to make safe habitat for nesting birds. Seed pods are left to ripen. Dead limbs, also called snags, are allowed to remain. In fact, some folks might argue that there's no reason to prune at all. After all, who prunes in the wild? Well, deer prune, and their little deer nibbles shape and stimulate shrubs. Fires prune and open up space and let in sun. And plants prune themselves, shading out interior growth or discarding lower branches. Of course, we create habitat gardens for ourselves too. The pleasure we get from nature's beauty feeds our soul. Aesthetics does matter. Plants which are allowed to grow completely uncontrolled will grow beyond the scale of a small backyard garden. Overtall trees and shrubs with too much dead material often get cut down and replaced before we get to enjoy the beauty of an older tree. So we prune. Aesthetic pruning seeks to emulate nature. We use rules such as coarse to fine, which describes the progression from heavy trunk to solid branch to finer branch to twig. We look for the essence of each tree or shrub, pruning to enhance the spring flower show, or maybe we want to show off the bark of a very old tree or play with the movement in the twining branches. This approach to nature makes aesthetic pruning perfect for the habitat garden. Natives can also be used to great effect in other styles of gardens with clipped hedges or cottage garden charm. And by the way, I want to thank the internet and Saxton for all these beautiful photos because I'm a terrible photographer. So let's talk about pruning. I suggest using this checklist before pruning any plant. Is the plant healthy? When's the right time to prune? How is the plant going to respond? And maybe the most important of all, why am I pruning? Let's go over these questions. Is the plant healthy? Pruning reduces the plant's ability to make food, and so pruning can weaken a plant and slow its growth. As a rule, pruning won't make a plant healthier. Some diseases can be removed with pruning. Other systemic diseases need different approaches. When's the right time to prune? Pruning during a dormant phase helps avoid putting stress on your plant. As a general rule, plants are dormant just before the push of new growth. In the Bay Area, most of our plants do best when they are pruned during their late summer dormancy, although riparian and deciduous plants can also be pruned in their winter dormancy. However, rainy seasons, especially warm and wet conditions, can introduce pathogens to open tissue. How is the plant going to respond? Before you start pruning, it's useful to know what it's going to do. You may want to know, for example, will the plant hold its shape if you prune aggressively, or will it respond with vigorous shoots, or will it die? Because gardening with California natives can be so site-specific with different soils and different sun exposure, you will want to rely on your experimentation, experience, and observations. Take notes throughout the year on what's going on in your garden, on how you pruned, and how the plants respond over the coming season. Why am I pruning? What caused you to pick up your pruners? Is the plant too big? Don't wait until the shrub is 5 times as large as you want it to be. Aggressive pruning is more apt to introduce disease, and aggressive pruning is just ugly. Instead, keep your plants within scale of your garden's design by pruning them annually. But if you did wait until your plant is 5 times as large as you want it to be, don't try to reduce it in just 1 year. Make a plan to reduce it over 3 years or even 5 years. Take pictures of your work, some before and after photos, and take notes on what you learned. Or maybe you are pruning because you want to develop a particular look in your garden or tree. Pruning to show off the special beauty of each plant is what I especially enjoy, and it feels like a conversation. This is different from talking to your plants. Instead, we're listening to them. In this conversation, the plant puts out some new growth, and I respond, and it responds to my work. Pruning can simplify a form or balance a structure. Once again, it is not something you'll achieve in a single year, because the tree will keep providing new material and new possibilities. I'd like to quickly demonstrate some pruning cuts and discuss how to choose what kinds of pruning cuts to use for different goals. Let's see. Now, first, I know that pruning on Zoom is a new art, so I'm not sure if you'll be able to see everything very well, but we'll try here. Okay, a thinning cut is useful for reducing a mature woody plant. Thinning removes a branch or side branch at its point of origin. So I don't know if you can see this. I'm just going to take that off completely. When you make a thinning cut, don't leave much of a stub. Cut just outside the branch collar, or if you can't see the collar, which looks like a swelling of branch tissue, simply leave the smallest of stubs. Use hand pruners or on larger things, a pruning saw to make a thinning cut. A thinning cut can be used to simplify an open structure and tends to make a tree or shrub more interesting to look at. It can become a focal point in the garden. Thinning cuts are good ways to get light into a tree and encourage inner growth, which we could all use, right? Reduction, releadering, or drop crotch cuts are different kinds of thinning cuts. You can use this cut to shorten the reach of a long branch, like so. I'll return to these. Heading cuts. Heading cuts shorten a stem. Heading cuts should only be used on leafy stems that are flexible. So I'm pruning this just down to a leaf node. This branch is kind of inflexible, so I'm hesitant to use a heading cut on this because it's just going to result in a lot of side growth. So to reduce this huge thing, I've used a thinning cut well, you cannot see really. I'm taking it all the way off and reducing the whole size of this plant. Use heading cuts to reduce the overall profile of the plant. As I said, heading cuts stimulate growth and can result in new interior growth and creates denser foliage. Shearing is a bunch of heading cuts done all at once. Heading cuts on wider diameter branches and trunks is also known as topping, which opens plants to disease and looks terrible. Heading cuts, topping of trees, is illegal in many cities, including San Francisco. I'm coming back. Sorry, I'm looking for my material. Okay. Let's go back to manzanita. Pinching is a kind of pruning that you can do with your fingers or with pruning shears. Pinching is useful for an established plant that is essentially the size that you want to maintain. Pinching is also used to encourage denser growth. So I'm just going to a leaf node, and well, that one's a little hard for my fingers, but just pinching stuff off, and it'll push the growth further into the plant. The last type of pruning cut I'm going to mock demonstrate. It's called coppicing. Coppicing is to take a plant down to the ground, barely leaving a stump. Plants that resprout from the root can be revitalized through coppicing, although the new growth may be made up of much longer, straighter, whipple-like growth. Redbuds are a well-known example of one plant that can be revitalized with coppicing, and burl manzanitas can be coppiced as well. Really quickly, I'm just going to do a little pruning on this redbud. It's a little thick inside, so I'm going to do a thinning cut. It's a little higher than I want it to be. I'll do one more thinning cut here. I don't know if you can see that, sorry. And maybe a little bit of tipping. Depending on plant needs and your objectives, almost all of these techniques will be useful to almost any plant in your garden. There's a list of different woody plants, and I've checked off the different kinds of cuts you might want to use. And here's some plants that I call semi-woody. I hope you'll enjoy conversing this way with the plants in your garden. As you help your plants share the space in your yard, through the conversation and over time, individual plants in your garden will stay in the bounds of your yard, but grow in beauty. Finally, I'd like to make a plug. I encourage everyone who wants to learn more about growing California native plants and habitat gardens, or about pruning, or about soil, to visit Merritt College's Horticulture Department in Oakland. There are year-long classes as well as weekend and evening classes. And right now everything is online, so what could be easier? And you can reach me at gonative@sonic.net. I hope this introduction to pruning in the habitat garden was useful. Aesthetic pruning is a wonderfully fun way to talk to your garden. Thanks for your attention.
Allison, this is wonderful. We've got a little bit of time, so if you don't mind sticking around to answer a few questions, that would be great. Let's just say, so we've got a question from Marla asking, did she hear you say that burl manzanitas can be coppiced?
I believe they can be.
Ooh, wow, that's exciting.
It's essentially you're acting like a fire, but using your tool. Right.
Wonderful. Is there any way to share that pruning table online, if you wouldn't mind?
I can send it to you.
That would be great. If you send it to me, then we'll add it to the California Native Plant Society Yerba Buena chapter's biodiversity resources.
Yeah.
That would be wonderful. Thank you. Good question, Grace. Let's see. And Priscilla's got an interesting question. How do we determine if a plant is established?
In what manner?
If it's well enough to make it through a summer without maybe enough help, or are established well enough to be pruned.
Well, you have to ask yourself again, why do you want to prune it? And if you've got a plant that's that new, I would think twice about that. But once plants start pushing their roots out, you're going to see new growth. A sign that a plant has really put its roots into the new ground is that you'll see new growth coming out.
Okay.
I would say that that's a plant that's in a good situation.
Marla Yonamine has a question about pruning Malva rosa to get denser foliage.
Well, I would use tip pruning, or just heading or pinching, just to bring the energy in.
Interesting. And Susan Payne's got a question about how, when and how much would you cut back a Matilla poppy?
Well, I don't think you can harm a Matilla poppy. So if it's taking over your yard, that's not a. Again, I would go to looking for something that is aesthetically natural looking. When you start being so aggressive, you can tell that you've been there. That means you've gone a little bit too far.
That's a great recommendation. And Susan Payne's also got a question about coppicing or redbud. How much do you leave for plants that are pretty young, like 1 or 2 years old?
Well, don't cut that down. It's a young plant. I would only use coppicing on a plant when either it's starting to decline so much that it's not attractive anymore. It seems like it's starting to die. Or if you want to encourage really straight stems, and my understanding that was used to form tools in Native American communities. So I don't know what the goal would be to cut down something that young.
Great. Okay. Let's see if we have any other questions. Oh, Chrissy Freeman's got a really interesting question. What does it mean to be a certified aesthetic pruner, and how might one of us go about becoming one?
I'm trying to think of the short answer to that. Aesthetic pruning was developed by my teacher, Dennis Makashima, and he created a series of classes that are offered at Merritt College. a certified aesthetic pruner, goes through all those classes, generally is a professional and works for a year or two, and then is given a test by the association, Aesthetic Pruning Association, to verify skills. And come on over. If you have any questions about that, you can send me an email. I'd be happy to talk to you about that.
Oh, that sounds lovely. Thank you. We have more questions. Diane has a question about pruning brittle bush in Celia californica.
Well, again, I would go to these different types of pruning techniques and think about what you're trying to achieve and use them accordingly. So you could use a little bit of heading cuts if it's getting a little too leggy, or even some pinching, but I really would have to see the plant in particular, or a better description of what's going on with it. I'm always doing it while it's in dormancy is pretty key.
Great. Got a question about an overreaching spice bush that's blocking a path. Removing the branches, go to ground. What do you recommend?
Oh, they're such beautiful plants. I would try to do some thinning cuts, reduction cuts, and see if it could be brought back into its space. It sounds like it's reaching for the sun, perhaps. If it's a little too wide for the space, you could do some thinning cuts to get that stuff that's getting into the pathway. But if it's really big, it's pretty happy there. So experiment with it before you give it the single cut.
And Kathleen's got a question about pruning a palm-like plant. Hers has new growth down low and not so healthy growth at the top.
Well, palm trees are not quite a woody plant. They're their own thing. I would be looking at the culture of the plant and see why it's not happy, rather than thinking that pruning is going to help it. So see if it's waterlogged, if it's not getting enough sun. Do some research on what your plant wants first.
Wonderful. And a question about thickening up the inside of a ceanothus. What do you recommend?
So again, it sounds like this person wants it to be denser inside. And so what plants do is they put their growth out to the tips, the ends and the top. And now you've got a hollow shape. So do a combination of shortening some of those branches or stems and opening it up a little bit to get light into this inside of the plant. You're not going to necessarily get a dense plant as a younger plant, but well, actually ceanothus takes shearing quite well, and I've seen that bring more growth to the inside. So a lot of tipping is what I guess I'd recommend there.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Allison. This has just been fantastic to get a chance to listen to you and see a demonstration. Thank you so much. And
my pleasure.
look forward to getting the table from you that we'll share on our website. Really appreciate you making time for the community here and answering our questions as well.